Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support this bill. The Labor Party will be supporting this bill through the House. We do have some reservations. We certainly opposed the bill at first reading, but changes forced at the Finance and Expenditure Committee by the state sector unions and by Labor have averted disaster for government workers who were set under the previous version of the bill to lose their redundancy entitlements and employment rights. As I say, Labor members and members of the PSA and the CTU are satisfied now with what has been achieved. So we are now much more comfortable with this bill. It was heavily amended in committee, and the work of the committee is important. So I congratulate the members who worked on the bill itself. Those negotiations have been fruitful, and it's important that this kind of legislation is able to succeed governments, go from one government to another, and preserve stability in the sector so that people who work in the sector have some kind of surety around their employment provisions. That leads to a more settled sector and gives the people who work there the ability to focus on the job at hand rather than worrying about whether their conditions are going to be axed, as was proposed by the government in the first version of the bill. And so my congratulations particularly to the PSA and the CTU for their involvement and for what has been achieved through the committee process. Mr. Speaker, the previous Labor member who spoke, David Parker, drew attention to the issue of leadership and said that if you don't have good leadership by ministers in policy terms, unfortunately this bill will achieve nothing. This bill is there to support good policy and the implementation of good policy, and indeed that is the role of the state sector, there to challenge ministers, to provide free and frank advice, and also to support the implementation of policy that is put forward by ministers. So we, over this side of the House, are not confident that this will lead to great policy by the current government. If they have the wrong policies, or no policy or no plan at all, no amount of fine-tuning how departments deliver that absence of policy or that bad policy will help create a better New Zealand. And this government certainly has a poor record in that regard. John Key is on record as stating he thinks that Kiwis are paying about the right amount for power. Now, the current policy that's in place is being fine-tuned by this government, but if it's the wrong policy, no amount of fine-tuning will fix it. Labor, on the other hand, has put forward a policy that would see the sector reformed, that would see the creation of an entity called New Zealand Power, which would make sure that Kiwi power bills for the average family went down by around $300 a year and would put a lid on future price rises. Now, this kind of policy could be implemented more effectively with this legislation, which ensures that the agencies work together in a productive way. It strengthens the role of the State Services Commissioner and in ensuring that government agencies work collaboratively as a system. In fact, for the first time in this legislation, Mr. Speaker, the Commissioner's role is set out in legislation. In some ways, it is a wonder that that has never happened before. Certainly across the sector, it's been asked by many agencies what exactly the role of the State Services Commission is, and now this is laying it out in a way that shows the kinds of levers that the Commission has to ensure that there are clear lines of accountability within the sector, that there's transparency in reporting, that there are sanctions and rewards, and certainly the Commissioner is responsible for making sure the correct sanctions and rewards are in place for leaders of departments, that the appropriate policy provider splits are in place, and other public sector management principles are observed. So this legislation makes sure that the state service is more effective, that there are the right safeguards in place, and that the chief executives have the power to delegate statutory functions as appropriate. So the new organisation arrangements also covered in the legislation, the departmental agency as a new organisation, will be interesting to watch. We'll see how that plays out and whether that delivers something more than what we currently have in place. But to return to the point, there is no way that this legislation will create good policy. It can't create good policy. That is for governments to do. That is for them to campaign on. That is for them to put out in the open, to have tested, and the public may be convinced that there are advantages in certain policies. They'll elect a government. This legislation will give the opportunity for that government to then implement stuff effectively. The leadership of this government has been ineffectual, for example, in getting the economy back on track. We know that this government here present in the chamber, and Mr Lotoinga is concerned about it as much as I am, I think, by the way he's shaking his head at the record of this government. They have the worst economic record of any government in the last 50 years, Mr Speaker, and no amount of legislation like this can correct for that. We know that historically, in the last 50 years, the economy has grown much faster under Labor governments than it has under national governments. It's grown at a rate of 3.7% on average under Labor governments and only 2.9% under national governments in the last 50 years. So Labor governments, by nearly a percentage point more, grow the economy faster than national governments. But this particular national government has the worst of any record. It's actually dragging those averages down. And that's why I see those backbenchers there looking down, shaking their heads. They're embarrassed, and so they should be. I would be in their position too. And I guess that's why we see Mr Joyce and Ms Collins at the front there already jostling for position as to future leadership. Maybe they think they have a plan. Certainly it couldn't be any less of a plan than is currently in place. This government seems content to let things ride, to let this situation continue, to see New Zealanders paying more than they ought to for power. They won't intervene. They know that housing, for example, is another area of policy where we see Kiwis no longer able to afford to own their own homes. And that is affecting a great number of Kiwi families. Now, Labor said that it will implement an affordable housing policy called Kiwi Build. Now, this kind of legislation will enable us to implement such a policy more effectively when in government. But this government, which has no plan for housing, which is content to see housing prices skyrocket out of control, won't fix anything with this legislation here. This won't help them form a plan. No, by no means, Mr Speaker. And we know that this government has no plan for the economy. Minister Joyce in Select Committee was not across his portfolio when he came to speak to the economic development to the Finance and Expenditure Committee, and he had not got his supplementary estimates questions in on time. He was a minister who wanted to delay that. I asked that the committee postpone the hearing of evidence because Mr Joyce wasn't across his portfolios, and then the national members on the committee blocked that. That's on record, Mr Speaker. In fact, I moved a resolution at that committee that said that we postpone the meeting until such time as the minister is across his portfolios. And so scared were the members of the committee that they agreed effectively. No, it's on record, Mr Hayes, and we'll look forward to hearing what you have to say that would contradict this when it's down in black and white. The members of the Committee for National were not prepared to postpone the meeting until such time as the minister was across his portfolios. I think they didn't believe he ever would be, and that is the issue. This government is filled with members who are not across their portfolios, who don't have an effective plan for growing the economy, and so ordinary New Zealanders are suffering. As median wages go down, as costs go up, as New Zealanders out of work can't find a job, those people who want to work hard to improve the lot of their families are faced with a government that's interested only in the big end of town, that is seeing small business suffer, that is seeing ordinary Kiwi families take home effectively less pay because the work is not there and because the conditions are not right, because jobs are not there, because this economy is struggling with a government that has no leadership, no plan, and no way of looking out for the little guy. It's a government that's only concerned in the big end of town, and Mr Speaker, this legislation won't help that. This legislation will not form a plan for the government. It will only help a government deliver on its promises that actually has a plan. This government will not be saved by this legislation. That said, it's good legislation. We will be supporting it because it will enable future governments that actually have a plan to make positive change in this House for the betterment of New Zealanders so that ordinary Kiwis can finally get a chance to get ahead in an economy that grows. That'll be a Labor government, and hopefully it'll come sooner rather than later.
I call Louise Upston.
I commend the bill to the House.